and debunking any myths surrounding it. So this is the team. I'm Rob Reed, Technical Evangelist at Cockroach Labs, and I'm joined by Todd Golding, who is a Senior Principal Cloud Architect and Global SaaS Tech Lead at AWS. A very imposing title, and you put me to shame, Todd. Thank you very much for joining us.
If the more characters you can get in there, the better it is, right? So.
I think so too. I think I might have to add a bit more to my title to elevate me to your level. So, as I say, we're going to be talking about multi-instance, like multi-tenant application architecture today, and we hope that you're going to come away with a better understanding of that, an appreciation of where to use it and where perhaps not to use it, and we'll hope to address any of your concerns as we go. The Q&A is open, so if you have any Q&As, if you have any questions as we go along, please drop them into the Q&A and we can address them as you go. So the Q&As, until we publish them, the questions are completely private, so we can see them and you can see them. So there's no silly questions. Please, we want to keep it fairly dynamic. So if you've got any questions at all, just hit us up. So first, we should talk about Todd. He's a very distinguished engineer, architect, and leader who's written the books on generics in .NET 2, back when I was enjoying .NET 2.0, I think, is when I started my .NET career. Fantastic piece of technology. I loved Link. I think that might have come in 3. Maybe a little bit later on, but that was a cracking bit of technology. And he also wrote the book on multi-tenant SaaS application architecture. So Todd, thank you very much. I think we're in safe hands with you. So let's start. What is multi-tenancy? Todd, I think you're probably in a better position than I to give a holistic overview of multi-tenant application architecture, but what is it?
Yeah, I will say that, in fact, if you look at the book, I've dedicated a fair amount of discussion to this, because I think when I entered the world of SaaS and I came to AWS and I said, I'm going to sink my teeth into this topic, and I built a handful of SaaS solutions. I thought I had a pretty good handle on what I thought multi-tenant was and how people should engage the topic of multi-tenancy. But the more I dug in with customers, the more I started seeing what SaaS really looked like in the real life hands of businesses that were building SaaS solutions. I realized the sort of the classic notions of multi-tenancy that I had didn't really fit with the sort of SaaS notion of multi-tenancy. Because if you look at where we started with multi-tenancy, the classic notion of multi-tenant is, I've got a piece of infrastructure, I'm going to let multiple people share that infrastructure, and that is multi-tenancy. And that is 100% a valid definition of multi-tenancy. And in fact, if you look at cloud architectures and other environments where you're sharing compute or you're sharing storage amongst multiple users, that is a definition of multi-tenancy. But if you take that same concept and you then look over at what SaaS providers are doing, yes, some SaaS providers are sharing infrastructure, but constraining the definition of multi-tenancy to just infrastructure shared or it's not shared is far too narrow. Because when you get into the world of SaaS, what you find is that people have all kinds of variations depending on the personas and the workloads and the domain and all kinds of other factors that shape and determine, how much of their infrastructure is actually shared or not shared. In fact, you'll see people who are still SaaS companies but offer entirely dedicated infrastructure to each of their individual tenants. And so the question was, well, then what is multi-tenancy if there's all these gray boundaries between whether infrastructure is shared or not shared? And so we decided to take that term, the notion of whether infrastructure is shared or not, and pull that out of the discussion entirely, and make multi-tenancy more about how you're operating and running your business. So for us now, multi-tenancy is more that you are running one unified environment. You're onboarding all your tenants collectively. They have common billing. They have common operational constructs. And everybody gets the same version. One of the most important litmus tests of SaaS is when I do a deployment, everybody gets the same version. Now, what's actually in the application box being managed through that pane of glass can vary a ton. Some infrastructure will be siloed, is the word we now use to say whether it's dedicated. Some infrastructure is pooled, meaning it's shared by some tenants. And then just allow for the fact that that variation of sharing or dedicating infrastructure is more about meeting the needs of individual tenants or meeting the needs of your domain, but you're still operating as a business. You're selling as a unified experience. You're onboarding tenants as a unified experience. And so we call that collective experience now multi-tenancy, and then use different words to describe the state of whether or not infrastructure is shared or not shared.
So is it safe to say then that the term multi-tenancy applies more to the customer's experience of the infrastructure than it does to the orchestrator's experience of the infrastructure?
I think I would not quite describe it that way, only in that I would say if I'm a customer of a SaaS system, honestly, I might care. There might be some point at which I care, but generally I'm trying to consume your service, and I'm less concerned about what's shared or not shared. Now, that's not true for some domains. Some domains are very picky about what's shared or not, but generally it's more that, hey, I consume it as a service. I have an as a service experience. And really where multi-tenancy becomes a factor is how am I operating this environment as a shared experience across all of my customers as a business versus, say, managed service provider model. Like if I'm managed service provider as a business, I'm actually offering potentially customers one-off solutions, and it's more of an installed software experience where each customer might get their own version. It's not managed collectively and for across all the customers. In fact, customers might get their own copies of the software and decide when or if they're going to opt into a particular version, right? So for me, multi-tenancy is the value system I have as a business, which is saying that I'm going to get my agility, my innovation, my scale, my economies of scale out of treating all my customers collectively. And that to me is the thing that says I'm multi-tenant SaaS, and that's my value system as a business. And then for my customers, they're going to see the upside of that, which is they're going to see faster releases. They're going to see us innovating faster. They're going to see better, hopefully lower prices, because they'll see us taking advantage
Economies of scale. Yeah.
They'll see more tiered offerings so they can opt in at the level that's interesting to them.
And scale their business alongside each tier. Yeah. When would you want to consider then? You identified a business as potentially being in the mindset of multi-tenant applications, but when as a business, whether you're in the mindset or not, should you consider creating your SaaS application as a multi-tenant solution? And perhaps where would you want to avoid it?
Well, in general, I would say that like the effort to build a multi-tenant environment is not small, right? Like there are lots of effort, lots of hard questions, lots of bits operationally, technically, like there are lots of considerations. So there's a whole book I've written on it clearly. So there's a lot to think about what it means when it comes to deciding how you're going to build a multi-tenant environment. And it's not trivial. It's a big undertaking for a business. So for me, we often talk about, well, SaaS is a growth strategy for many businesses, which is to say that I'm willing to spend all that energy to build all this automation and build all this agility and build all the mechanisms that are needed to achieve this agility because I'm expecting to grow my business substantially. I'm going to try to reach into new market segments. I'm going to just try to grow my base of customers substantially. And the more my business grows, the more I take advantage of the fact that I've built all these economies of scale into it. Now my operational costs aren't going up. I'm getting better margins. But if I'm just saying, well, I've got 10 customers today and I only want 12 and I don't have ambitions to get to 1,000, is the effort and the energy to invest in multi-tenant SaaS worth it to me? And that's the question I really ask people is like, what's your ambition as a business? What are you trying to get to? What's your view of growth? What are the markets you're trying to get to? Because a lot of times people are trying to get into either go upstream or go downstream to get into new markets. If you don't have those ambitions and you're really just saying, well, it'd be nice to share some compute or it'd be nice to share some storage, that's okay. Like do what you can to do that, but you may not fully embrace like a multi-tenant SaaS model.
I think it's exactly that. It's not only a mindset, but also quite an investment. You need to have a strategic mind to think my trajectory is growth. I need to then capitalize on economies of scale. Therefore, I need to make I'd imagine, a sizable investment in creating my SaaS product to be multi-tenant. I've got
Just
experience
something
with.
to add on this real quick. Sorry to interrupt you
No,
there, but
not at all. No.
there's a parallel to this because a lot of people are in the microservices space today. They want to write microservices for everything, right? It's the same sort of notion there. Microservices give you economies of scale. You get autonomy, you get smaller deployments, you get all these things, but they come with complexity. So it's a mirror of that a little bit, which is like, I tell people, not everybody should go deep and write hundreds of microservices for their system if the complexity of their system or the scale or the nature of the workloads in their system aren't going to get the value out of that. So you're getting complexity, but you're not getting the value.
I think you've answered a question I had for you later, actually, is it's essentially at what point should I start thinking in terms of multi-tenancy? Because what I hear is don't boil the ocean. If developing and the costs associated with developing a multi-tenant SaaS application are prohibitive, especially at the start of your business, don't develop a multi-tenant application and perhaps convert it to it when it makes sense.
Yeah, well, the weird part of that is I think what you said is accurate, but what really happens for a lot of companies that are sort of thinking about SaaS, they're really, it starts more as a business strategy than it does as a technical strategy, right? So you will see, for example, companies that have reached some level of operational complexity where they have like 100 customers now, but every new customer is more painful to add and it adds more operational overhead and their margins are getting worse. And they're actually trying not to grow their business too fast because the overhead is so high that it's too painful. And those businesses will decide, independent of technology or independent of multi-tenancy, like that is not a sustainable path for them. And it's those companies that are often saying, well, I need all this economies of scale and operational goodness as a business if I really want to successfully grow. It's just not sustainable for me. So, or you'll see it start as a business just to say there are competitive pressures in our market right now where other people in our domain or our space are able to move faster than we can move. We can't react and respond fast enough to the shifting market. So those end up being the factors that ideally means I need to think about SaaS. That's the model I ought to be considering. Then you go to the tech side of the house and say, okay, what flavor of multi-tenancy, what is going to best fit our solution?
And I think that leads us on very nicely to the deployment models available for multi-tenancy. Then you mentioned silos, you mentioned pools. I have mixed here, but I think it's also called hybrid or sometimes bridge.
Bridge,
I'm no
yeah,
expert,
I'll use
but
there.
could you walk us through the various types of the models available and when you might want to consider each of them?
Yeah, yeah. So at the most foundational level, if you just pick the most generic sort of application of these terms, they were first invented to just characterize whether infrastructure is shared or not shared, right? So silo would say any resource, and the key here is I think everybody always wants to go to compute. This applies to anything, queues and streams or storage or
You,
compute or
memory,
anything you
data.
want.
Yeah.
Silo means it's dedicated. Pooled means it's shared by multiple tenants. And mixed was here, and I've called it bridge over the years. I've called it lots of different things. I clearly haven't settled on a term here, but the idea is not everything's exclusively silo. Not everything's exclusively pool. My infrastructure could be a mix of some things. Compute could be pooled, but storage could be siloed, and so on. So mixed is really just trying to get to the idea that it's not a one size or binary sort of decision. I'm not deciding I'm siloed or I'm pooled. I'm saying on a resource by resource basis, I'm deciding whether or not they're siloed or pooled. Now, if you come a level up from that, you can also then say, well, we talk about full stack silo, for example, or a full stack pool. And those models are saying all the resources in a full stack silo model means storage, compute, everything for that tenant is siloed, dedicated to that tenant, or in full stack pooled, everything is shared for that tenant. But those are just extensions of the silo pool sort of concepts that are still foundational. The same thing. You're just saying, well, yeah, I want to do full stack silo, meaning I want to share nothing, which is what some people want to do. And the other thing that comes up here is, again, not like you could talk about full stack silo and full stack pool, and people think they have to choose one or the other, and that's really not true either. I could say I have a tiered system, and I have basic tier tenants and I have advanced tier tenants, and I will put my basic tier tenants in a full stack pooled environment. But my advanced tier tenants who are willing to pay me a premium for their dedicated infrastructure will get full stack silo. Then you take that and think about mixed, and then the reality is I could use that same tiering to say which flavors of things are siloed and pooled in a more granular fashion for different resource types, depending on your tier.
So you pay for the level of isolation that you achieve in a silo as a tenant, I guess. That's really eye-opening for me, because I didn't realize it could be siloed at an individual resource level. I didn't realize there could be potentially so many knobs to configure. And then at the higher level, it seems to be quite a hierarchical way of thinking about architecture. So you could be a siloed tenant, you could be a pool tenant, you could be a pool tenant with or a silo tenant with pooled CPU.
Mm-hmm.
It really depends on your appetite for how siloed you want to be.
Yeah, and think about that. What I encourage architects to say is, ask your customer will come to you and say, I don't want to share this resource. Like, I don't, but they'll use a really big blanket statement. But when you ask if more sort of granular questions here, you find out, well, really, I don't want to share the data is what they're really saying. But they're not really saying they're not willing to share the compute potentially, right? Or vice versa, depending on the nature of the workload. Like, I'm okay with sharing the data, but I'm not willing to share the compute for that.
Noisy
Right?
neighbors.
I'm worried about noisy neighbor.
Yeah.
I'm worried about some other condition. Well, those questions depend on each. Imagine all the services of your application and the nature of the sort of workloads they're supporting. What silo or pool for each one of those could be a strategy you have as a business. You could say, well, we can always pool these resources for all tenants and get great economies of scale, and they'd never get noisy neighbor. But selectively, we want to offer this particular service in a silo as part of siloed with other services that are siloed, because the packaging of those as silo has value to customers that are willing to pay for it more.
I see. And could you leave would you leave a separate pooled equivalent of the services or services for customers who would prefer to remain pooled for cost reasons? Or is
It's more of a strategic, for me, it's like I always tell people, start with pooled, assume you're pooled for everything, and design and build as if you're pooled.
Okay.
And then as a business, decide where would you might choose to offer silo to people. And so I want it to be more based on a customer's desire to get more value and willingness to pay more to get that value for me to offer them something siloed, right? And so I want to find those boundaries and those dimensions along which somebody would say, there's more value in this piece being siloed to me. And so for me, that means I still can get all the economies out of the scale, out of the things they don't care about, or for the tenants who are not worried about noisy neighbor or different SLAs, they're all willing to run in the pool. It's more that, like, when and how do I sort of extract silo? Now, for some domains, some people will say, I don't even care about noisy neighbor or anything else. I just never will store data side by side with any other tenant for this. I won't allow it because I'm in some highly regulated or some highly compliant environment. And then in that model, but even then, people will make the mistake then of siloing all the data for that tenant, when in reality, there's a subset of that data that they're really worried about. So I don't have to silo it all. I just have to silo the data they want siloed.
Yeah. I've seen a question. It came in a few minutes ago. Apologies for the delay and get back to it. The slides, as you'll see throughout, are going to be fairly minimal. They will be available, as will a recording of this. So apologies for getting back to that late. So let's go on to some concepts then, Todd. We talked about security and the appetite for various tenants within your portfolio to be siloed or pooled. I look at this, I see control plane, the word plane, I see the word auth, and I immediately think about orchestration and security more specifically. My idea of multi-tenant application architecture, or maybe a default idea of multi-tenant application architecture is perhaps it's inherently less secure than an entirely siloed model or single tenant application. Is that true? Is that a correct assumption? How would you address that assumption if someone comes to you, their use case is very clearly towards a multi-tenant SaaS application, but they've got concerns about security? And I guess from the other perspective as well, you've got a customer who's worried about the security of their resources, their data. What would you say to both of those parties?
Well, I'd start by giving the classic sort of architect's answer to that, which is it depends. um,
Okay,
so,
next slide.
so I think conceptually, the idea that you're commingling resources, commingling data, you're commingling compute, there's a natural sort of tendency to think, well, that means there are security challenges. And I would say, yes, there are new security challenges, but there are also security constructs, even when resources are pooled, that that can be used to protect those resources, right? So, in fact, you mentioned tenant isolation earlier, and hopefully, I'm not jumping ahead for you here. But like deployment models, we talked about siloed deployment, right? One of the biggest points of confusion is somebody will equate a deployment model to isolation. The reality is, if I silo your resources, I've done nothing to make that more secure. I can still have somebody running in compute and still cross a boundary to get to somebody else's resource, even though it's running dedicated, right? So for me, the security is in a multi-tenant application, and the isolation of resources, whether they're siloed or pooled, becomes the responsibility of the multi-tenant architecture. What I will say is it's much harder to secure those resources because for some types of resources, you get a really natural, fine-grained way to control it by tenant level. For other resources, it's much harder to do that. So in that respect, you could argue, well, is it less secure? No, I think it's more challenging to secure. But you should still have as a goal, I want to secure that resource. I want to be sure that one tenant can access the resources of another tenant, because that's table stakes in a multi-tenant environment. So my qualifier is that it's harder to get it right, but it's not less secure once you've
Got it
now.
right.
If something's physically isolated and it's got all these natural, like clear, big boundary barriers to be able to block access to it, yes, it's easier to isolate, and maybe you're more comfortable with those boundaries because they're easier to express to your customer.
And that leads me on to my next question beautifully. I hear, especially from finance customers, anyone dealing with PII, personally identifiable information, that as a rule, multi-tenancy doesn't satisfy their requirements for security. Now, what I'm hearing is, let's say we're offering a PCI certified product. Our team are PCI certified. The architecture is multi-tenant, but developed in such a way that data is isolated and can be proven to be isolated. What would your response be to a customer who says multi-tenancy as a rule just doesn't work for us, in light of an application that's been designed securely for multi-tenancy?
Yeah, I don't buy into that sort of that model. I think that if you have compliance or regulatory or sort of external demands placed on your business that say the footprint of your business has your data, for example, is the common sort of piece of that puzzle, you're absolutely going to use that input to be able to say, this is why silo and pool exists as concepts. Some of my infrastructure will end up being siloed because my industry and my compliance and regulatory demands make me put it in that format. That's fine. But this is why the term multi-tenant, like I can still say you're multi-tenant, but have siloed data, because I still may have other bits of your system that are pooled, and I'm still operating and managing you collectively. So for me, you can still adopt a SaaS delivery model, and you can have parts of your system be multi-tenant, and I should say pooled, and parts of your system be siloed, and still, like, that's still SaaS to me. So for me, it's more about figuring out what it is about your environment, what it is about your domain, that is dictating which silo or pooled strategy you're picking, and then asking yourself whether or not you can get to a security threshold, even for the pooled resources, that makes you comfortable. But I think it is a myth to think that multi-tenant systems just can't be secured, because in general, like SaaS is one of the most fastest growing, most widely adopted solutions. And if people are breaking the security boundaries of SaaS every day, you'd be seeing it all across your experiences, because it's the most fundamental thing that if it breaks down, sort of erodes the trust and the acceptance of your solution. So people are finding really good ways to run in these large scale environments and share resources and still meeting the security needs of their customers. It's just in the nuances of how.
And I suppose even the customers who would say multi-tenant applications aren't secure enough for our security posture, they're still migrating their workloads from on-premise data centers to places like AWS, which I guess you could argue from an infrastructure perspective are multi-tenant environments anyway. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that is the ironic bit of this, which is even if you don't adopt SaaS, but you adopt the cloud, you're still adopting a level of multi-tenancy. It's just you're entrusting the infrastructure. And that's why I talk about tenant isolation being, and the notion of multi-tenancy being this layered discussion. Because at the cloud level, whether no matter what, you're already buying into some level of multi-tenancy and accepting the cloud's security constructs as protection of your multi-tenant resources. And then what happens is when you build your SaaS app, you're building another layer on top of that is now your sort of shared security model between that top bottom layer and your application layer to arrive at like the overall sort of isolation footprint of your application.
And as you mentioned earlier, I guess it comes down to the how comfortable a tenant feels in that environment. They might feel comfortable moving to AWS and at an infrastructure level being multi-tenant, but they're not quite ready to make the next step for a particular SaaS product in an entirely pooled respect.
Sorry about that. What's ironic here is some industries I thought would never be SaaS. I thought healthcare would never be like lean into SaaS, especially like sort of clinical information, people's health information. And I have worked with large health information system providers who know that the only way for the economies of scale of their business to work is to operate in a SaaS model. So for some industries, or even competitive pressures where a SaaS competitor shows up in a space that has not been traditionally SaaS, and they move faster, their prices are better. Sometimes that's a forcing function that says, like, we weren't open to embracing multi-tenancy, but we may need to now.
We're not comfortable with it, but it's what we can afford.
Yeah, exactly.
So talking about isolation a little bit deeper then, is there a silver bullet for isolating tenant data? Obviously, there's different models of it. There's the pooled approach where you might, in a database scenario, create different database instances for different customers. There's perhaps a different schema, database tables. You might have different you might have a column that denotes a tenant. But is there a silver bullet, in your opinion, based on your experience in working with customers of AWS, that is a good isolation solution for multi-tenant data?
There are good solutions, but there are not good universal isolation strategies depending on which data. So we talk about data partitioning, and we separate data partitioning from isolation. The same like way we separate deployment models from isolation. There, for each type of storage, NoSQL, relational, object storage, search indexes, all those things. Each one of those technologies offers some way to partition the data to be able to say the tenants are in their own schema, or they're in the same table, but they've got foreign key that separates them. There's a range of really good options for how to partition the data. But as you partition the data and then you say, well, now how I'm going to apply isolation policies to that data, now you're dependent on what the technology lets you do. Like a search index versus NoSQL versus object. Each one of those have their own security constructs. And some of them let you get really fine-grained. Like if you look at DynamoDB on the NoSQL database on AWS, that database offers all the way down to the item level security construct. So I can say just this, even though you're using an indexed sort of view into that data, I still can create a policy that prevents cross-tenant access. But then when I go to a relational database and I'm using a foreign key, I may not get that same level of control over it. So I may choose, in fact, to put something in a separate table or a separate storage construct just to achieve my isolation goals, because there isn't a policy with the granularity I want that aligns with the way I want to partition the data. Now, noisy neighbor with data gets into this as well, though, because you might also just think about, like, I might separate the data here just because I'm worried about how many tenants are hitting that database at the same time.
So we touched a little bit on data and resource isolation there. In your book, you mention gray areas. What can you define what those gray areas are and how people should address those when it comes to building their own SaaS product?
Yeah. So the point is that this is more of an isolation story probably than it is a data partitioning story, which is, and it's kind of back to the theme I was just getting at here, which is there's sort of vendor provided, cloud provided, sort of isolation and security constructs that are out of the box available. But then let's say none of them are available to you. You could still have what we would call application enforced isolation here. And now it is, you're saying, well, none of the out of the box tools that I want will work, but I still need something. And this is where you get this sort of undefined space where it's like, what do I do? What's the way to approach it? And the answer is, go look at what's available. Am I going to use some RBAC tool, or is OPA going to work for me? Is there what kind of I'm going to write something from scratch to try to do it? The problem is, I think a lot of times what happens is in those scenarios, people just say, well, we're not going to be able to like apply a policy there, and that's just what it is. And I want to encourage people to try to fill those gaps and fill in that area with some kind of solution, just because I don't want to leave your data open. I will say I do still run into organizations that think that if you and you've done authorization, that the request is trusted at that point, and therefore you don't have to worry about having these really strict policies on accessing data. Because when we're looking at isolation, it doesn't have anything to do with, it's all about the tenant. It has nothing to do with the current user. And if a tenant 1 is doing anything to try to access tenant 2's resources, I need a policy that sits between me and that resource that enforces that. But a lot of people will say, no, I got into the service. I trust my code. My code will not access the wrong tenant. And for me, I prefer that next layer of control over that, because we see too many situations where well-intended developers still end up accidentally doing something that crosses a boundary to another tenant's resources. So you have to fill all that in with your own sort of creativity when there's not a built-in mechanism.
That sounds quite as someone who hasn't built a multi-tenant SaaS application before, that sounds my immediate response to that would be, if I'm in the position where I'm having to make those decisions and my application code could even remotely give a tenant access to the wrong tenant's information, I'm probably using the wrong tools at that point. And perhaps it's time for me to re-architect to tools that are more suited to building multi-tenant applications.
Or I might pick a different partitioning strategy, or I might move the way that data is represented, our resources are represented, to align to something that I know I can then enforce the boundary of. But I might, in doing that, I may have to make a choice which will make the operational and the cost footprint of my solution a little bit heavier, but that might still be worth it. Yeah, that's it. That is one of the hardest parts of this multi-tenant space, is getting this isolation story right. Even within isolation where you have policies, we still have what we call deployment time isolation versus runtime isolation, which is The easiest one is I deploy an infrastructure, I define its policies, I put it out there, and no matter what the code does, somebody can't cross a tenant boundary. But when I deploy, say, a shared table that's shared by multiple tenants, there's nothing at deployment time that's going to protect that from cross-tenant access, because it intentionally holds data from multiple tenants. Now at runtime for each tenant request, I have to assess who you are and what you're trying to do and apply a policy on the fly that prevents you from accessing resources you're not supposed to get to.
My goodness. Now, I'm going to get to a point where I might as well ask it now, because this was something I planned to do anyway. I look at the best practices. I hear what you're saying about getting multi-tenant right in terms of isolation, and then you mentioned auth. Then you've got the tenant access code. Then you've got the deployment and versus runtime isolation.
Yeah.
And I look at this as someone who hasn't developed a multi-tenant SaaS application before, and I see a lot of complexity. If I were about to start building my first multi-tenant application, let's say I've for some reason decided that it has to be multi-tenant, how could I do it as simply as possible?
I think the weird part is these concepts are hard because they're like, you have to make hard choices about your approach and your policy. But if you look at if you sort of take these things out of one of the goals you'll see in the guidance I've given in the book is that you don't really want developers like having these multi-tenant decisions imposing on how they're writing their code. You want them mostly focused on delivering the value they're trying to deliver. So a lot of this is about creating these sort of cross-cutting constructs that make it easier for developers to adopt. And the implementation of, say, this runtime isolation, we have this thing called a token vending machine that we use on AWS, for example, that applies these policies dynamically, automatically sort of implements your isolation of that runtime dynamic bits, hands you back the credentials, and you don't care. As a developer, you just say, I want to access this thing, give me the creds back, I'm going to go access it. And how all the policies are applied or any of that is all outside of your view. So a lot, and even that token vending machine isn't super complex, but what we've done is we've put it as a shared construct that then gets shared across all the different developers that are developing services on the system. And I think when you finally accept and draw the boundaries and the policies, and you've got good mechanisms to apply them universally across your experience, it's not so hard. I think it's at the front deciding that architectural strategy of like, what am I going to do and where is that policy going to be? And those are the bits that are, if you don't know that stuff, yes, there's a big learning curve. There's a big effort that goes into like getting your head around that and figuring out what you're going to do. But once you like need to turn it into code, it's not crazy hard. I think where more of the effort actually happens, believe it or not, in the DevOps side of the house of this, which is when we have all these different deployment models, we have all these different tiering systems, how you onboard a tenant, how you route their requests, all become all this contextual bits. Like even as I'm releasing a new version of a microservice, well, which tiers get which copies of this, and how does it get rolled out and deployed? I actually feel like that's where a lot of the complexity comes in. So I wouldn't downplay the complexity of these environments. I do think there's a lot you have to get your head around, but I just don't think it translates, except for the DevOps bits, I don't think it translates into like massively complex code or really tough things to write. It just means investing in the right pieces and putting the right helpers in place.
And that would certainly make sure that every developer on your team is singing from the same hymn sheet, reduce the amount of potential pitfalls. Because I'm guessing in a multi-tenant environment, if you get it wrong, it could be very bad for every tenant, the reputation of your business. So whatever you can
just
do,
along those lines, because this is a big part of what you're talking about, where do I start almost kind of thing, like what should I do to get off the ground? You'll see me always talk about, because we didn't get into control plane versus app plane a bunch, right? But control plane is all the cross-cutting bits of everything, billing, onboarding, everything on tenant identity, all those bits that are meant to manage and control that whole life cycle of all your tenants. And the app plane is then where the actual app functionality implements tenant isolation and data partitioning and all those other concepts. And what I will say to people is start with that control plane and get the fundamentals of your control plane working. get the automation of what it means to introduce a new tenant into your environment, even if you only have a few services, and get tenant context injected into the experience from the beginning. So how do I bind a tenant to a user? How does that user auth? How does that token get injected into the application plane with that tenant context? So now all of my application services now have a tenant context coming to them. What are they going to do with it? How are they going to apply it to data partitioning? How are they going to apply it to isolation? All those other bits, right? If you get those mechanics kind of right, then you're sort of forcing yourself to deal with multi-tenancy from the outset.
And I think this is a global rule. There might be a law somewhere that defines it, but I always say to people, it's easier to go from two of something to three of something than it is to go from one of something to two of something. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. If you develop the system for two tenants, you've got a much better chance of adding the third tenant as if you developed the whole system for one.
Yep, that's a huge mistake. Lots of people say, "Yep, we're building a SaaS system." It's ironic. Startups, you think startups are the ones who have the most runway to go build all this stuff, right? But they're chasing venture capitalists. They're chasing the next customer so much that they land that first customer, and then they're thinking about how to land the second, and like they're doing lots of things, often one-off. And so even those companies, when they're building a SaaS solution, they don't bake in all these foundational sort of mechanisms from the beginning. So you'll find a startup who's brand new in SaaS, a year into their life, needing to rewrite their system.
Riddled with tech debt,
because
sure.
they didn't think about, well, and to be fair, for some of those companies, landing those first 3 or 4 companies is what it's all about. So maybe that's the natural life cycle for them, but it's like kind of ironic.
Now, you mentioned mistakes there. What are the most common mistakes that you see tenants making? You've mentioned mistakes a few times throughout this, but if you had to list the top 3 mistakes that people tend to make when developing architecture for multi-tenant applications, what are they?
I will say that you'll see this all across the book. SaaS, you've said it yourself at the beginning, SaaS is a business model, right? And I feel like the business side of lots of companies don't realize what it means for them to engage and become and transform into a SaaS model. And the tech side of the house doesn't understand how much more they have to be driven by a set of technical strategies. So for me, too many companies see this as either we're just going to SaaS, throw it over the wall, and the tech team will go figure out how to make it SaaS, and we're going to be there, right? And I will say, if I'm a good SaaS architect on the other side of that, I'm going to say, I don't even know where to start, because you haven't told me like what's the markets we're going after, what are the tiers we're going to go after. I need to know what kind of deployment models we're going to have to, what kind of isolation models, what kind of scale we're going to have to achieve and support. How am I going to achieve the economies of scale? Those are all things that the business needs to know and be driving. Product owners have to think more about what's onboarding like, and what are the metrics they're really going to trace differently. So for me, this becomes too much of a tech first kind of mindset for a lot of businesses, and they aren't really looking at the holistic sort of view of how adopting SaaS really touches almost every dimension of how they run the business. Or they'll put the other piece of this I'll add is that's number 1. Number 2 of that is people will undervalue the importance and the need for new operational sort of models, new operational views of their system. If I am building a true multi-tenant system, I get all this good enough. Like imagine I've got thousands of tenants that are consuming my system all at once. And now I can know, what are they consuming? How are they consuming it? How's it affecting the infrastructure? How effectively are they onboarding? How soon do they get to value? And you'll see these organizations who just grabbed their standard off-the-shelf sort of previous operational models. They just grabbed the same tool bag, and they're using the exact same tools they used for a non-multi-tenant environment to run this multi-tenant environment. So this tenant's having a problem. What's going on? I guess I could go sort through the logs and try to figure out what's going on for that tenant. Or people with this tier are seeing SLA problems. I need to build a much richer operational, tenant aware, tier aware, with new views into the environment that are also telling me things about the customer's experience as part of that operational view. I need metrics that are all new metrics that are multi-tenant kind of metrics. So I
And this
don't
goes
think
back to your
people,
control plane comment earlier. Get the
yeah,
control plane right first, because you're going to be asked by your business leaders, has this tenant reached value? And if you haven't built it for that, you haven't got the metrics or the observability to be able to tell them. So not only are the tenants going to be getting a bad experience, but the people who are paying your salary are also going to be getting a bad experience of the setup.
yeah. And then I would say that um, that I feel like that people are not always thinking about growth as an outcome there. So maybe the third thing here is they're not really designing for growth. They're not really challenging the boundaries of like, what is it? What will it? We're going to build all this multi-tenant thing. Like some people, you'll say, well, what are the personas? And they'll just say, we just have one persona. They'll just charge them based on consumption, right? Well, you now have all these tools and mechanisms at your disposal to be able to say, well, we could actually have entry level customers who only get to consume this with this level of consumption, whereas our advanced tier who are willing to pay us more, will offer them this kind of experience. Instead, they'll just treat it as a one size fits all experience, and they won't think about, well, how can I queue myself up for growth so that if we go into a new market or we go into a new space, like if I say tomorrow, I told some team you're going to get 1,000 new tenants tomorrow, a lot of teams will be like, oh no, we can't support that. Whereas I think a team that really was prepared for this and architected for this beginning, they are testing for growth from the beginning. They are designing for growth at the beginning. They're thinking about how the system and economies of scale will adjust for that growth. Because to me, if you do all this and you still don't realize the economies of scale side of it, you may not have achieved the overall goal of the business.
And you haven't answered your business. You haven't answered your business need, or you're not treating multi-tenancy as a business strategy, which is
Yeah.
the first mistake.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, one thing I neglected to do was if you go back far enough in the slides, I showed both of the books. There is an offer. Todd has kindly offered 40% off his book. Is that physical copy, ebook, Todd?
I think it's ebook copy. So, and
so
I will just a disclaimer. There's I don't know if like that's limited to a certain number of books or if that's wide open. So just ideally, everybody would be able to get that discount though.
But that should have popped up on your screens now, the 40% discount code. Thank you very much for that, Todd. So we're coming to the end now. I would be remiss if I didn't also say that as CockroachDB's technical evangelist, you can get started with CockroachDB for free. There's a link that you can go to, cockroachlabs.com. It's also available on the AWS Marketplace if you want to try it there. Cockroach Cloud is a multi-tenant solution, and we do have pooled and siloed versions of that for depending on your requirements there. And finally, I just want to open it up one more time to questions. I can see that we've had a couple more questions since I answered the first question, and we'll just go through them now. So we have a question here: what exactly are the pros of multi-tenancy? Now, I think we've gone through to quite an extent on the pros of multi-tenancy and the considerations. But if you had to define it as a bullet list, Todd, what would it be? I'd imagine economies of scale.
Yeah, it's agility, innovation. Like innovation gets lost in this one, right? We move faster, we innovate faster. It's operational efficiency and cost efficiency, and it's growth. Like it's like you are trying to build the mechanism and the machine that can move fast, react and respond faster, and allow your business to achieve its results. And for some, that might just be operational efficiency, and that's enough. But in the grand scheme, ideally, you're trying to do more than that.
The next question is, if we need to, for example, verify something over all tenants, then I would need to have access to all tenant information. And I'm guessing that comes down to the separation of app plane and control plane again, where
Yep.
you've got enough information that's cross-tenant to give you a holistic view as to how your application is behaving at the top level. Would that be correct?
Right. So you'll see in the book, in fact, we talk about different types of users and different classes of users, right? We have tenant users, tenant admins, who are all about a tenant-centric view of the environment. And then we have system admins and system users, who are more the ISVs who are selling the SaaS solution and supporting all their tenants. They obviously get a different view of the environment. And then even in some SaaS environments, those there may be keys that are used to protect data to even prevent admins from being able to see the data. It depends on the nature of the solution you're building. But clearly, like at the control plane level, you're going to need some level of access to all the tenant environments to be able to support and operate the solution.
Yeah. Another question. Generally, how are the responsibilities divided among teams? Now, I'm guessing this touches on what you mentioned about the application teams and the DevOps teams that are touching the multi-tenant application. But at a high level, how would you categorize the responsibilities of and the touch points of a multi-tenant application from the perspectives of the teams developing it? Now, obviously, there is no standard for what a team looks like. Every team is different across every company. But in your experience, the teams that are developing successful multi-tenant applications, what do their teams look like, and what are their responsibilities within each of those teams?
It's kind of ironic because I don't think their teams look wildly different than what people want a modern software organization to look like. If you look DevOps as a discipline, the whole point of DevOps was to bring developers and ops teams together and work more tightly together. I just think SaaS sets a higher bar for all of that, right? So ops teams just cannot, and dev teams cannot function like with in silos at all in a SaaS organization. Actually, I would even say product owners cannot function in a silo at all in a SaaS business at all. So what I mostly see is that if you think, for example, about the control plane and the app plane, they have a boundary between them, but the nature of what's actually being provisioned and implemented inside the app plane has strong dependencies on what's in the control plane. And the control plane has strong dependencies on how it's going to get metrics and analytics and what data it needs. And what does it mean to manage the life cycle of a tenant moving from basic tier to advanced tier? That reflects into the application plane. And then think about things like onboarding is absolutely dev and ops's job, and the product owners all care about how cleanly can somebody sign up? How soon are they getting value out of the system? What metrics are we using to track that? So I feel like everybody's just way more integrated. Even you will see customer success changes wildly here in a SaaS organization. Like they are way more tied into how do we proactively reach out to customers? We're not just here to sort of react and respond to events. And this gets into, well, what views do ops have or what tenants have? They'll even look at like, are some tenants starting to reduce their consumption? And is that a good time to outreach to them to see what's going on? So it just all feels like they have to have a vision that's collectively developed of what they're trying to achieve. And I like to see organizations that hold them collectively accountable for the service experience that they're delivering. So I want goals that are shared across these parts of the organization, because I feel like they all play a role in delivering that shared experience.
Thank you for that. There's one more question, and that's, do you have any recommendations on how to encrypt data with keys that are controlled by the tenant? I'm guessing we're talking about CMEX or customer managed encryption keys, but at the tenant level within a multi-tenant environment.
Yeah, there's a lot of approaches to that, and they very much depend on like whose technology I mean, that strategy is a valid strategy, and they can be tenant-owned keys, absolutely, in the scenario. So we see that, and then it gets more into like, how and when are the keys provisioned? How are they delivered to the tenant? What's the life cycle of those keys? Those things. But it's not like there's this one size fits all sort of answer to that. It kind of depends on which kind of data you're using and what key system you're using. I believe there's a blog post or two on AWS about this that we have that I can go hunt down for you and see if I can get you a link. But I don't have anything off the top of my head.
Okay. Todd, we've reached the end. We've been going for just under an hour. So thank you so much for all of the insights here. I've learned a great deal personally, and I hope that our attendees have also learned from you. Thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. We will be publishing a on-demand version of the webinar. So feel free to watch it. And if it provides any comments, feel free to comment if there are any questions that you are dying to ask but didn't get the chance to this evening or this morning, as the case may be. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Todd. It's been a real pleasure, and hope to see you all at the next webinar.